Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to another episode of Surveillance Exploring the Utiliverse podcast, where we engage in meaningful conversation about the electrical grid of the future. And I'm very delighted to have Dr. Vadari with us today. Hello, Dr. Vadari. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I am doing good. Very well. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity for you to join us. And one thing before we get started, given that we have known each other for quite some time now, in industry, all hats here, and to help with establishing a conversational environment, I'd like your permission to address you as you are known to most of us in the industry as Manny. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
No lack of respect there, but definitely be able to have that conversation, so that's wonderful. So I believe both of us, we talk about the topic, and we're ready, I believe, for a very engaging discussion on the future of the grid modernization activities and the key pivotal roles of distributed energy resource in that future. And I believe you have made some comments around what does DERs mean and all that, and I would love to be able to explore and expand on some of those some more. And I think you mentioned also things like IBRs, grid forming, grid following. So some technical terms we'll be focused on in the conversation. That'd be wonderful for the audience. I think more importantly, how some of these technology are now available at some commercial scale that will be influencing the utility strategy across the different regulatory and geographical territories. I think some of that is going to get into our conversation. I think that's going to be great. And for the audience, I believe Manny's insight will undoubtedly shed some additional light on these complex topics and providing greater clarity and direction for utilities navigating this transformative stage. I'm not setting very high expectations there, Manny, just in case.
Not at all. I will try my level best to meet them.
Yeah, well, here it is. I will give the proof in the pudding. So how am I sure of these statements? So let's go to the tail of the tapes on Dr. Vadari's bio, briefly to set the stage, right? An IEEE fellow, 35 years in the industry in a variety of leadership roles, including technology, operation, and consultancy. And currently he is the president of Modern Grid Solution, a strategic consulting service provider with a team of industry subject matter experts. An affiliate professor at University of Washington currently, and an adjunct professor at Washington State University. In all of that effort, he also found time to write 2 books on the topic, Smart Grid Redefined, Transformation of the Electric Utility, and Electric System Operation, Evolving to the Modern Grid Second Edition, and has authored over 100 industry papers, articles, and blogs. He's on the board of 2 companies, industry experience with Patel, Accenture, Arriva, T&D, and Alstom. I am so honored even that you can find the time to join us today with all of those activities. Very impressive.
Thank you so much.
Any particular area that I may have missed, Manny? Let's take a time and maybe focus on you a little bit in the beginning, right? Since I set that stage, any highlight that you have you want to talk about Modern Grid Solution as a team or some of the work and the teaching in the book? Maybe we'll spend, some minutes there initially to kind of explore some of those to help our audience.
Yes. One of the areas that I tend to be very passionate about, so from a professional perspective, is how do we make things easier to implement? We talk about ADMS, DERMS, and we'll get to more of that in the podcast, but how do we make them easier to implement? On the personal front, my favorite topics are mentoring of young adults, high school adults and college adults. And I tend to spend many hours at many local Starbucks providing mentorship to high school students. So that's a little bit of a background on me as well.
Wow, I know that for sure because you have mentored me a number of times over the years. I'm not that young. So I'm including that class, and just for the audience, as a professional, as part of Survalent, we've reached out to Manny and his team on a number of these fronts because how quickly I think the technology is evolving. Okay, maybe let's jump in there right away. I think we're going to throw out a number of acronyms. We're going to talk about DERMS, DERs, IBRs, and all this stuff. And And I want to kind of get your initial thoughts to set the foundation when some of these acronyms get thrown out. And then we'll dive into the specific. But in the conversation about distributed energy resources, now the terms, I believe, in the industry, maybe at least the last couple of years in the more mainstream, IBRs, inverter-based resources for solar and wind, right? An energy storage system, and behind the meter and in front of the meter. Perhaps let's spend a little time on some of those nuances because it does matter. It does matter what technology you use, what vendor you consider, what ecosystem that may fit in. I would welcome that based on your understanding. And sometimes it's quite tricky, all right? You may understand it this way, and a utility may understand this way based on the jurisdiction. The definition, sometimes we have to normalize them. Welcome some thoughts around that, Manny.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think it's very important to set the stage in what these terminologies actually mean. We tend to use the word DERs, or distributed energy resources, to mean just about everything that is not what I would call conventional resources, as in coal, coal-fired, natural gas-fired, nuclear, hydro, and so on. So keeping that in mind, I think it may be better for us to go into calling them inverter-based resources, because when we look at solar and wind, for example, or even the word renewable-based resources, because then what it allows us to understand is that their behavior, one, is different, how we interact with them is different, and most importantly, certain basic things that we as power system engineers come to count on, things like inertia. When you have a coal-fired unit or a natural gas-fired unit or a hydro or a nuclear, we come to depend on some things like generator inertia, which solar and wind just do not have. So calling them inverter-based resources allows us to normalize them around a different standardization of terms, which then helps us focus on what can we expect from these resources.
Thank you for sharing that set of information there. And, from the vendor perspective and talking to utilities, you're right. There is a need, frankly, for better understanding of some of these terms and what it means, whether it is integration within the distribution system, managing them, accessibility, all of those kind of things. So I think the industry is worthwhile to continue to receive some of this understanding.
One more differentiation that I think it's important for us to add is that these resources, these newer types of resources, could either be front of the meter, meaning they are grid scale, meaning they are larger, or they could be behind the meter, at which point in time they could be the rooftop solar in my house, or a storage device in my garage, and so on. And when we also talk about front of the meter, we can talk about distribution scale and or transmission scale. So the scale becomes important because if it is transmission scale, then its impact on the balancing authority is non-trivially significant, whereas if they're distribution and small, they are much more smaller and their impact is not as critical. Lastly, these resources can either be supply resources, meaning they're a part of the IRP or the integrated resource plan, or they could be delivery resource, at which point in time you're looking to them to give a different set of services. And we will get to that later in the podcast.
Yes, your interesting comment around, I kind of wrap up when you're talking about scale, right? So technology and are getting pervasive. The cost point are getting down. How to deploy solar now almost become a commodity, right? So it's rolling out there. As it scale up, this is where transmission, distribution, utilities, and balancing authority becoming more concerned, right? I mean, then that means that has really impact on the grid. It may impact the direction of power flow, coordination, distribution, automation. So I think that's important. But what you see and understanding, at least the area and the focus that you have and the engagement with utility, would you say that things will only, the front of the meter stuff we're just getting what I would say larger and larger in scale and be impactful. But really behind the meter, the scales would, like a residential, would be similar in size, servicing their local load and maybe some export. But then there's many more of them. Directionally, I think you can confirm those kind of trends. Yeah,
absolutely. With one exception, the word behind the meter also is a rather dubious term. The reason is that I could be a Target store, or I could be a Safeway or a grocery store or a university, and now suddenly behind the meter could still be somewhere between 2 to 5 megawatts of solar and or storage that is sitting behind the meter, that at different points of time, whether it's during the day or during the week or the weekend, could pump out a whole bunch of electricity into the grid. So there is a commonality in how they behave. So it's important to understand each of these nuances.
Yeah, I think that's some point. You just said that, right? Because generally we think behind the meter, not a C&I scale, right? Like your big box store or some large facility that had combination to all of this. And we'll touch on microgrid and some of the other terminology. But behind the meter, I think generally the industry, at least the conversation we have today, is all about kind of resident scale, right? That's invisible. You don't have access. You don't have data. But then complexity, once you have EVs and all those things that kind of talk that whole DERs there. So let's touch on, I think, to your point, the storage side, right? So the storage and IBRs and the cost point are coming down and scaling up is, I think, changing the paradigm for all the renewables and all the intermittency. And now things are just getting paired together, right? Now they're designed for particular objectives. I think would be great to hear what you see there. How do you see utility utilizing some of these things and the choices that they are making?
Yeah, storage is making an impact at a variety of levels, as you can imagine. One, of course, is the ability to kind of smoothen out the outputs of solar and or wind. Right? So that's one thing storage does very well. However, storage also has a tremendous amount of potential to provide other services. Storage can be used to provide services like ancillary services, spinning reserve, regulation services, and so on, making it extremely valuable and cost-effective. Because depending on the type of storage, it can react really quickly. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it that a lot of people don't realize is when we look at storage, it can come from a variety of technologies. Not all storage is lithium ion or some kind of an electrochemical mechanism. There are new types of storage that are coming up. In fact, the line that I use is that the most successful storage for the next, say, 5 to 10 years has not even been invented yet. We are looking at things like gravity scale storage. We are looking at a new technology that just came in the market earlier this week called the energy dome, that is coming from carbon dioxide that is getting converted to liquid and then reset up as gas driving a turbine. So there are so much research going on in storage because that we believe will be that ultimate technology that will allow these renewable-based resources to actually survive and, more importantly, give us that net zero ability in the future.
I think to your point there, the capacity of the intermittency, particularly solar, right? Significant growth everywhere. I think the technology well proven is deployed out there. Now how to capture those excess, and we all hear about negative pricing in the marketplace, right? I was reading something today around Texas and ERCOT, right? The hottest day, I think over 85 gigawatt or something like that. And they comfortably went through that period and because the solar contributed really well in this summer. And yet really storing those capacity into that kind of the duck curve at the back end when everybody go home. So I think perhaps the development, the innovation race is on, on that technology to allow to capture those resources and dispatch them later. I think one thing you touch on also is the use cases, right? And the flexibility is very interesting. And there are new business model, I assume, whether it's utility owned or a commercial industrial owned. So you see some of those as kind of the entity that would own, invest, develop, maybe operate, and contributed to the utility, whether it's transmission balancing authority, new capability, and that's only going to get accelerated. Is that would be a correct perception?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think expecting a utility to be the only investor in these technologies, I think is extremely limiting. You're going to have, and you're already seeing, private investors, and which is getting actually accelerated in places like markets or places with wholesale markets where you're seeing the FERC Order 2222 being slowly rolled out, that you're going to see aggregators investing in key technologies such as this as well. So you're going to see a lot of non-traditional, non-utility investors who are going to be looking at solar, wind, storage in all forms, because wherever they see an opportunity, they're not bound to a rate case. They are not bound to a 40-year rate of return or a 20-year rate of return. A private aggregator, if he or she can make a significant proper profit in a week or two, and if they can get their entire capital outlays resolved in that time, if the market prices are high enough, they will take that chance, which a utility will not. And possibly rightfully so should not. Because utilities are bound by rate cases, and they have an obligation to deliver that kind of return to their ratepayers and investors.
Yeah, I think on balance, I think in the U.S. at least 3,100 utilities, maybe 100-ish IOUs, right, who operate on a different kind of business model, size and scales, and then you have the 3,000-ish public power and cooperative. And to your point there, every utility depends on where they are, what they do, their priorities, how they can invest, and the rate case is primarily the one that drives that. And we'll touch on it later, but when you talk about entities coming into the market that will behave and act differently with those assets, that ultimately may have an impact on grid operation or utility. What should they do? What technology should they invest? Well, we'll get to that. But I think those are the questions that the utility will be interested in. How do we get the data to flow properly? Is it mostly grid edge or centralized? So I'm just kind of park that there, because I think that's a point that's going to be important to at least explore. We may not have all the answers as part of the vendor community. We say, okay, how are we going to get all this together? But let's kind of jump back to your university and some of the concept you have. I think given some of the reliability issues, right, we have wildfire, we have flooding, all of this, and data center coming up, I think the whole microgrids, right, localized power that in industry are taking and packaging some of these technology. I see more and more of these entities that package and deliver. And I would expect that those serving their own need, but ultimately also will bid to the market if the regulatory or the framework to do so gets there.
That's a great point. I actually look at it from two constructs. One of them, of course, is the microgrid, because microgrid is focusing on contiguous load and generation. And the other one that is getting a lot of attention lately is what we call virtual power plants. The virtual power plants and microgrids are kind of very similar, except one is contiguous and other one does not have to be. The concept is still the same, because you're trying to combine load and generation and trying to keep them somewhat in sync. Microgrids, of course, have the ability to completely disconnect themselves from the grid or stay connected to the grid depending upon what the business model is, and or, as you said, what the regulatory model is. Really comes back to a key point is, how do they behave at that point of interconnection back into the grid? That point, the behavior at that point will generally be defined and must be defined by the utility. This is a question you asked about 5 minutes ago in terms of, to not necessarily support or encourage, strong behavior on part of the developer. That what I think the utility will need to do is to make sure that those protocols at the point of interconnection, point of common coupling, as we call it for a microgrid, are defined so that whatever you do inside your microgrid, don't care, but at the place where you connect to the grid, we want to make sure that we are all in sync on what our expectations of that behavior is.
Total agreement. I think when we have different OT and IT system and different vendors are managing this, some system, to your point, are managing directly through the cloud, right? That's the general control, how all the data will get exchanged. So as we talk about the grid edge and some of this, maybe let's touch on one more asset that I think is everywhere now, but pervasively. Given you're on the West Coast, you see a lot of this, but EVs, right? I mean, 5 years ago, you go to an intersection somewhere, you barely see any. Today, right, if you're in California, like every intersection, there'll be 2-3 deep of EVs, and then all the vendors out there, and there seems to be a market pause. But maybe perhaps give us the insight on how you see EVs in combinations with these behind the meter and all that. One thing for sure is that utility load will need to go up. They will need more capacity to address this need, and welcome your comment on those.
Absolutely. I see, just like we talked about DERs, front of the meter, behind the meter, and everything else, I see EVs primarily in two major categories. The first, of course, is residential EVs. The electric car in my garage, connecting to a charging station, charging, on a class 2 charger or something like that. But there is another key category of EV that at times tends to get missed, and that is what I call fleet EVs. Fleet EVs tend to be your FedEx or Amazon trucks, your school buses, your metro buses, which tends to show up everywhere. And it's very important to keep them in mind because they tend to have concentrated block loads. So that's one side of the equation. The residential EVs kind of bring that dispersion factor to say, if it's completely dispersed, maybe it's not as big an impact on us, or the grid, that is, right? So keeping that in mind, the need to track both of these types of EVs becomes important. Why? Because it's very important for us to understand what their behaviors are. The behavior of one, the residential EV, is very different than the behavior of a fleet EV. Fleet EVs tend to make very standardized routes. They know how it is. They know how much time that EV spends in the depot and how much time it takes to charge and all of those things, whereas the residential EV is much more unknown from a behavioral point of view. Bringing these two together, the utility is very important because understanding where those pockets are creates a major impact on how you deliver from a supply perspective that you were talking about. And another one that a lot of people don't realize is from a delivery perspective. It's not uncommon when you got these depots, for example, concentrated in a spot where I'm not supply constrained, but I may not be able to get delivery to that spot at the time that the depot needs it.
Yeah, so the challenge is here, and as they become more pervasive, I think utilities generally are concerned because generally they don't see, at least behind the meter of the residential stuff, right? How is that model? And we'll touch on that when we get into how should utility react on some of this stuff. We mentioned a few things about standards, and then when we can take a whole separate podcast to cover all of that. You mentioned FERC 222. So let's talk about that and the meaning of that. Most utilities may or may not be aware or may not be impacted yet. I think we would welcome some highlights around that and how it's changing the way, to your point, utility may be investing or other third party are investing, certainly to support that requirement.
Absolutely. So FERC Order 2222 was FERC's foray into the distribution systems, into the distribution grid. Until now, for the most part, FERC's jurisdiction sits on the transmission and the wholesale market side. 22 was the first time they said, okay, you know what, there is a lot of distributed resources coming up which are deeper into the distribution system. How do we take advantage of them? More importantly, how do we allow them to participate in the wholesale markets? So a new entity has been identified by FERC called the aggregator. The aggregator can take a sum of loads, a sum of generation, combine them all, and directly bid into the wholesale market while each of these components of their aggregation are sitting in the distribution system. This makes an interesting and a critical impact to the distribution system operator, because now some of their load, some of the generation in the system is being controlled by somebody else, the aggregator. And equally importantly, that interaction now between the distribution system operator, the aggregator, and the wholesale market is going to be formalized.
So it's more or less the rules of regulatory in the U.S. to create the market. To your point there, and as the market open up and have the opportunity, more will come into the market. And I think that's going to be important. Now, that's going to drive certainly the adoption. We just all hope, expect, design, plan for it, that the grid also keep up in terms of infrastructure and everything to get there. So maybe a few other standards while we are talking about this is welcome your comment around 2030.5, right?
Absolutely.
That seems to be in a lot of places that connect between the grid edge, right, to current control system, devices, cloud, and everything else. And I think we're still unpacking what they are, how utilities should use them, how they should specify them in their investment, and how should vendor also design and develop across that spectrum. And standards very much welcome, by the way, right, to ensure that the rollout does not customization. Some enlightening us on that would be great.
That's a great question, Young, because I think as you go, you unpack that a little bit. At one end of that is standards. The standards tell us, as long as we are all speaking the same language, we have the ability to ask for something and then get it. 2030.5 is a great interface standard that is now slowly emerging as the accepted standard, originally pioneered by IEEE, but then now being accepted by most utilities. What it does is it allows that packaging of the data that allows for a common interchange between all of these devices. More of them at the edge, especially when it comes to inverter-based resources that we just talked about. So 2030.5 is a good one. A communication standard that's coming around is the one called IEEE 1547. That's another one that's coming. What these standards allow us to do is they allows us to talk a common language, but that's not necessarily enough. We need business process interactions that say, if I have too much generation, I need to be able to curtail generation, DERs or inverter-based resources, or I need to be able to store them into something else. I need to be able to release them at the right point in time. So those interaction processes also, and protocols and rules, business protocols, not necessarily technical protocols, but business protocols and rules are also needed to make sure that when I ask for something, not only do you understand it, which a standard allows you, but also you do something about it because that's what I'm expecting you to do. A good example is that I have a congestion in my distribution grid. There is too much solar coming in. I ask you to curtail your solar and maybe store it in a storage device locally, and you do it. Otherwise, what I will end up as the grid operator is I will need to do load shedding because that's the only remaining alternative that I may have.
So how, the important question that we get asked, both utility and vendor, and maybe regulatory folks, is the maturity of these standards, man. You know, in our industry, it takes a long time to get something underway. 61850, you know, some of these things that we SIM, a common information model. But how do you see the maturity, or at least observing so far, like the pace of acceptance, right? First maybe denial, then acceptance, and moving and doing, those kind of things, and that's part of the conversation. But how do you see that? Because to your point, it's so important, right? That vendors and the community and that you don't orphan, you brand, you do something that's obsolete, you do something that's customized. How do you see that, and a recommendation, you know, for the industry to align ourselves to some of these standards?
I think it really comes back to a regulatory fiat, right? The regulatory fiat has to say that, and California did a good job on that, right? California said, we will follow 2030.5. We will follow this. Even if you go back, say, 10, 12 years ago, open ADR was a standard that California had pushed for. So you go down that path, at some point in time, the regulator needs to come back, or if a utility has the purchasing power that is big enough, then they could say that as well. But very often you want to influence the regulator. So this comes at, I would call it almost at I wouldn't call it a price, but there is a need of the day for us to educate the regulator also. The regulator is not necessarily trying to do the wrong thing, but if they don't know, then they may end up asking for something that may be unreasonable. And so whether it is a standard or understanding the need for common business protocols, it becomes important. Because even if you think about it, let's say Safeway or a Target, a grocery store, they have grocery stores across the country. Now, can you imagine how complicated it would be for them if the behavior with the interaction with the utility in Little Rock, Arkansas, is different from the interaction with the utility in, St. Louis, Missouri, or somewhere else. So you go down that path, so that commonality, that comes back to your standards and protocols and so on, becomes important, because a grocery store, which is a chain, cannot plan to implement 35 standards across the country, each of them different because the local utility wants it to be something different.
Well, that first 30 minutes moved fairly quickly there, and we barely touched on the topic. So we started with the trends. We talked about the assets, or some of the new assets by the definition, some of the challenges on operation. We also touch on the concept around standards, how that will be integrated. We talk about some of the business case. The next step I would like to do is now reflecting and applying on those challenges into operational system, right? How would we execute? How would we plan? How would we prepare for next? And that will be the next part of the conversation. And this brings us to the end of part one of today's episode. A very big shout out to Dr. Manny Vadari for sharing his thoughts on where the electrical grid is heading and how it's evolving in today's world. We very much hope you enjoyed the conversation so far and found some useful insights to take with you, whether it's for your work or just something you are curious about. Do make sure, though, to join us for part two, where we'll keep the discussion going and dive even deeper into the trends shaping the energy landscape. And if you like what you've heard, please don't forget to subscribe, drop a review, and share with anyone else you might find it helpful. And until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible as we shape the future of electrification. Thank you. We value your thoughts and questions, so feel free to connect with us by email to utiliverse@survalent.com, follow @Utiliverse on X, and post on X using the hashtag Utiliverse.